Hi everyone, welcome to this evening's coronavirus conversation on dismantling racism in museums. My name's Antonia, I'm Policy and Campaigns Officer at the Museums Association. I'm also a member of Museum Detox's committee. I'm going to be supporting facilitation of the session today. I know I speak on behalf of everyone at the Museums Association when I say that we're really thrilled to be working alongside Museum Detox for this evening's session to engage in this central issue of how we as a sector act to resist racism. I'm really grateful to our panel for offering to be part of this discussion, to share their lived experience of navigating racism in the sector and also share reflections and ideas for change. Before I hand over to our chair, Hannah, I've got a few housekeeping things to run through. Firstly, all attendees' cameras and mics are automatically turned off, but you can see a list of participants via the link in the menu bar. You can also use the chat function via your menu bar to talk to others, share links, and engage in this evening's conversation. As with all sessions, we ask that you stay mindful of conduct when using the chat, just making sure that we all strive to act with mutual respect of each other. We're going to make sure we share a link to our code of conduct as well. You'll have seen that we've asked for questions in advance of tonight's session, so the Q&A function isn't available. But as we've said, there's room to share comments and engage in the chat, and we at the MA will be sharing relevant links, so we'd really encourage you to do so as well. You can also get involved on Twitter using the hashtag MA Coronavirus Conversations. You can leave and rejoin the webinar at any time. We're also going to be recording the discussion today, and it will be available on our website later this week. Finally, just to say, please do bear with us if there are any technical problems during the webinar. If you are having any trouble, my colleague Rebecca Atkinson is with us today, and you can just drop Rebecca a private message and she'll do what she can to help. And that's it for housekeeping. So now I'm really pleased to hand over to Hannah, our chair for tonight, to introduce the panelists and start today's conversation.
Thanks very much, Antonia. I'm just going to go quickly round all of us so you know who we are and what we do and why we have taken part in this programme today in this discussion. I'll start with myself so that everybody doesn't feel like they're put on the spot. I'm Hannah. I've been a member of Museum Detox for about 4 years, and I've very recently joined the executive committee as the accountability lead. Yes, very passionate about the work that Museum Detox do, and I have considered them to be a very important support group for myself, working in museums and the art sector for the last 4 years. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Lisa and ask Lisa, just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and why you're involved in this conversation. Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Hannah. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here today, even though I can't see anyone. I'm Lisa, and I'm a socially engaged curator. I'm really interested in the relationships between institutions, artists, and the wider public. And I'm someone that is really passionate about advocating for the relevance of history. So within that vein, that kind of explains why I'm here, because this conversation is not new, but it's interesting to see kind of where we're at now and where we can progress moving forward. But a conversation is definitely necessary. So that explains a bit about me and why I'm here today.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Lisa. Deanne, can you please do the same? Introduce yourself and let us know where you're from.
Hello, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Deanne Nowler. I am a cultural and learning engagement consultant, but I've worked in the museum sector for 20 years, member of Detox for probably 3 or so years as well. And I've always worked within learning and engagement with local and national museums across the UK, and sometimes internationally as well. And for me, my interest in this is that I'm not an activist, I wouldn't call myself an activist, but I would call myself someone who wants to be a part of making positive change and empowering people who don't normally get involved in the museum sector to feel empowered to be part of and feel ownership of the museums that are theirs. So for me, it was about, this conversation was really interesting because it made me think about acknowledging my part in changes that have happened, that haven't happened, whether or not I have been part of the status quo or whether I've been part of real change. And moving forward, what can I do to be part of real positive change and actual impact rather than keeping things as they have been.
Brilliant, thank you. And Tara, last but not least.
Thank you. So hello all, wherever you may be in the world right now. My name is Tara, and I've been a member of Museum Detox for the past year, and I've also, since January of this year, been the Museum Futures trainee at the Horniman Museum. So my life in museums within the cultural heritage sector formally is still a sort of in nascent phase, if you will. I'm a new entrant to the sector, and prior to my time at the Horniman and prior to my time being engaged in Museum Detox, I volunteered and freelanced in various different cultural heritage spaces and institutions. And my passion for these spaces and for the conversations that happen within and without these spaces primarily comes from an interest in the intersection between culture and care. I was a volunteer on the Museum of Brands' landmark dementia research program. So I learned a lot about how we conduct and remake and shape memory and all the sort of notions that surround that, and how we can better engage people, particularly people that sit at the fringes of conversations with regard to audiences and cultural heritage spaces, how we can best engage them, capture them, but also make their lives a little bit better. And it's just that notion of making lives a little bit better, about caring, about nurturing, that I think sometimes gets a bit lost, because obviously when we're dealing with the day-to-day work of anti-racism, we're thinking pragmatically, we're thinking practically. Occasionally we can't find space to think joyfully. So I wanted to be part of this conversation to see if there are any seeds that I could sow about cultivating a sense of care for ourselves and for others, whilst doing the hard work of being anti-racist and making museum spaces more equitable for all.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. I think we've got three very interesting and very different voices here, coming from really different parts of the sector. So I'm very excited to be here with you and to ask you these questions. So I'm going to dive straight in. I'm going to pose the first question to start off with Lisa. Have you seen anti-racism in action within a museum, Lisa?
Before actually answering that question, I'd want to kind of pose a definition of anti-racism, and I'd borrow Professor Robert J. Patterson's definition, which is anti-racism is an active and conscious effort to work against multidimensional aspects of racism. And following on from that definition, I don't think I've specifically seen a museum within the UK embark on a process which is centered clearly on anti-racism. I know that there are similar kind of notions that relate to the conversation of anti-racism, such as decolonization, representation, diversity, and inclusion. But something that centers on anti-racism is something that I haven't come across. Obviously, I'm open to being proven wrong in a chat section, but what I have seen in terms of examples has mainly come from America, and maybe that's because of their particular history, which is different to the UK's context in terms of this conversation. But people have actually started to think about anti-racism within museums as part of their practice, specifically curators and educators. So there's one anthology called Curating as Anti-Racist Practice, Exhibitions for Social Justice. And there are also museum educators that have written about this in an open access journal, and their names are Radia Harper and Kiona Hendrick. One museum that I would say that has spoken about anti-racism specifically as part of their wider organizational work is the Abbey Museum, and they were awarded a grant as part of a decolonization project. And there was a specific part where they said that they would facilitate learning sessions around anti-racism and effects of acculturation. And also they spoke about engaging all staff from trustees and volunteers within cultural competencies assessments. So I think within the UK, we've almost kind of jumped the step to addressing anti-racism and approaching anti-racism as an organizational approach. So I think in order for anti-racism examples to be really seen within museums, I think it's dependent on what's the intention behind committing to anti-racism, because all of our actions, they have to have a purpose. Kind of similar to what Tara said about the pragmatic kind of focus in some of these conversations, I think effort is really important, because we can be pragmatic, but who sustains that effort? And that's something that is an area I think we kind of struggle within the sector. And finally, accountability is really important. Where does that accountability lie? Are those who are responsible for kind of ensuring that change and that process is present within our sectors? Is it clear? And how are organisations held to account? So that's kind of like my thoughts on that question, Hannah.
That's brilliant. Thanks for kicking off with that, Lisa. You mentioned a couple of papers and links and people. I wondered if you could put that in the chat, and maybe also the definition of anti-racism would be really nice if you could also put that in the chat. Yeah, Deanne, do you want to join in the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's, as Lisa said, it's a really interesting question of, has there been? And I think my first reaction was, again, even that I've been in different variations of that conversation of community engagement and diversity and inclusion and actions towards that training. But as Lisa said, it's never been specifically focused on anti-racism, whether that be a specific community, thinking about it being the Black community or other people of colour. It's always been very broad strokes, trying to include as many people as possible, which doesn't always value the differences and the particular barriers that are faced or created for those different communities. And I think I was trying to think of examples, and there are those that have really built connections within the community. You've got the Hackney Museum. There's obviously the projects that have happened in Pitts Rivers, thinking about decolonisation. But again, structurally, how does that work across an organisation to make it an anti-racist organisation? It's usually, from my experience, lots of very resource heavy, very well-intentioned, but surface superficial actions that happen, but they're not always grounded in a system that is going to mean that they are going to help change the shape of the organisation in their processes, in their attitudes, and therefore in their outputs as well. And so it is really hard to name those that are doing it. But it's interesting to see what's happened since June and the responses. So, you know, and looking to who is at least trying to focus on that, such, you know, the Wellcome Collection coming out with their statement, and Wellcome Trust, Somerset House, Roundhouse, just to name a few. But it is early days, and so really now it's like actions will speak louder than words, and what happens after that, those well-intentioned plans have been said, but how is it going to pragmatically, how is it going to come about, and what's it going to look like? So I think it's too early now to really know. As you said, maybe in America, where that's been more of a focus, we can see more what's happened, but it'll be interesting to see what happens here and whether we can really continue this. And yeah, the accountability, I mean, that feels like a whole other question, but yeah, if no one's holding anything to account, what's the kind of onus to keep going, apart from the moral and the humanity? So yeah, I'm interested to see what those examples are rather than knowing what they are right now. I think it's too early.
Yeah. Okay, good point. Tara, do you have any examples that you can come up with, or have you seen any really positive anti-racist work within museums so far? Or like the other panelists, do you feel that it's sort of like sort of actions that are particularly attached to one set type of anti-racist behaviour or work, rather than looking at a sort of an organisational, institutional, structural approach?
So I would say it's mediating between all the above, and to use the words of my fellow panelists, like to use that words as a springboard or point of departure, the word accountable and accountability is really kind of it's the word of the day. It's the operative word, I think, here, and holding spaces to account, holding museums to account, holding organizations, institutions, and moreover the people within them, the people that comprise an organization or an institution to account, involves agitation, it involves disruption, and that can come from within, but so often it comes from without. And so the sort of nominal examples of anti-racist work, and moreover work that I believe champions, and it sort of imbricates of the definition that was so brilliantly set out by Lisa, but it doesn't kind of like hit it full hilt. But the best examples I can see of that kind of work being done without an institution or outside of an institution, but having real effects and rippling within institutions, probably done by, the White Pew, for example. Shout out to Gabrielle and Zarina, who do fantastically well at keeping people to account, about making sure that we are all unable to avert our gaze from what is happening and has happened. And it's looking at these sort of multi-strands of time. We're kind of running towards a course of it being the operative, it being smart, it being the savvy, it being the maybe too moralistic to say, but the right thing to say, that we are all engaged in anti-racist work, we all want to do it, at least institutionally. But we're also running concurrently on a timeline of these things, demands that have been made by individuals and communities of the past still haven't been met. So there's a sort of chasm between those two states, where people are realizing, where institutions are waking up to the fact that this is probably for the best to be anti-racist and to actually pursue that within the hierarchy of employment, within outreach, within all kinds of other governance structures. But then they really haven't taken in the full scope of what has been done within and without institutions in years and generations prior. And so I think it does take more than, people like us and others, the people who are attending, who work within museum settings and engage within them in that kind of formalized way. It takes people who engage them in a more informal way, who are willing to, sacrifice some of the stability that comes from, titles and engaging with the paradigm in a really straightforward way, to disrupt and to hold people to account. And so, to clarify the myriad strands of thought that I've sort of put out here, I would say yes and no. Just because of the nature of time, just because of the nature of the demands that have been ever present and seem to be more pressing now than ever, but that has been said in generations past. So like Deanne, I'm sort of still waiting to see what can come from the discussions like these, that can come from changes in governance structures, that can come from new ways of working, new models of working more co-productively. But yes, ultimately, I think the best anti-racist work within museum settings is yet to be seen.
Great, okay. And I think some of the things that you've just picked up on, and Deanne picked up on, and also Lisa did as well, kind of leads us nicely to the next question, which is about those sort of statements of support that institutions put out, some of them rushed, some of them more sort of well thought out or thought out. So I'm going to apologise for the fact that I'm reading this question, but it's quite long. So I'm going to go to Deanne first and ask your opinion of this. We witnessed institutions across the board coming out with statements of support in response to Black Lives Matter protests. Firstly, what's your take on all this? And secondly, how do we move from statements to meaningful and sustained action?
Oh, it's an interesting question. It's been a really interesting time for me personally, and I mean, I will be speaking more from my own experience of being involved in questioning organisations about their responses, asking them how they're taking themselves forward. But on the whole, from kind of, being bombarded on Instagram and Facebook of the responses of different organisations, I have to say I feel a lot were, and I'm sure a lot of people agree, it was quite performative. We had the blackout, we had statements came out, we had some statements that came out that were just copies of other people's statements. You know who you are. And it was, it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't a surprise, but it was a wake-up call. And I found myself having to, as I said before, look at the true nature of these organizations and what they really meant and what they really stood for, considering the collections they had, the work that they did in certain areas of their audience and community development and engagement, and and what they'd done previously. So the organizations who had been renowned for it, which may have slipped and were now either reviewing what they'd done and realizing, or were a completely different organization now. And it was a wake-up call. I had conversations with some execs, with directors, as I say, not an activist, just asking the questions that some people maybe didn't want to. And I was told that I was willing to listen and there was space for conversation and dialogue. But often what I felt was that there wasn't always a way to continue that dialogue. There wasn't a communication structure that was actually being put in place to then really continue that and to keep that flow of information, of experience, of knowledge backwards and forwards, and acceptance and acknowledgement from the organization that it was needed and that they actually had to do something once they asked for it. It was very selective in the ways in which I found in which you were allowed to actually participate with that change in that process, especially as someone who now sits outside of museums as a consultant or someone who's in a slightly different field. I now no longer have that insight to know what's going on in an organization or that influence by being in the organization. And so for me, it's a real struggle to understand, as someone who's really passionate about museums and wanting them to really live up to their true potential of what they can do for everybody in society, well-being, knowledge, education, everything. I find it hard because I am not there. I am without, and the disruptors, as Tara was saying, it's a different proposition, and it's maybe, is that a proposition that I want to take up as an outsider? Do I now need to think about that, or is there other ways? And so I found it really interesting to watch as an observer, and that's one thing I can do, of what was put out, what was actually the actions that are being taken, and to continue, as I say, that conversation and to really make changes and to give it a space for accountability. Again, that's something I'm not sure how that's happening in a lot of places, and it's something that I will continue to investigate and to question, is how are you allowing for that accountability, or does someone need to just stop asking and do it a different way to make sure that there's accountability? But these are all difficult questions. So yeah, I am still working on that personally, and happy to hear from others.
As we all are. It is definitely a work in progress. Lisa, what do you think? What's your take on all the sort of plethora of statements, and what sort of, how do you feel about it now? How is it sustained? How could we sustain it?
Well, how do I add to what Deanne said? Similar to Deanne, I'm actually an observer as well. I like to look and listen, which I think a lot of people don't do, especially in this conversation. And it was interesting to see the statements themselves and then the conversation that surrounded it in terms of who said something, who didn't say something, why did they say something, why did they not say something. And it made me think about the word integrity, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot with everything happening in the world, but particularly in the museum sector. What does integrity mean at this moment in time? When we're in a moment in which there can be a lot of reactions to things that are happening in the world. We are, I think, a lot more reactive, part and parcel of social media. So there's a lot of words being said or not said, but I'm really interested in what are your intentions behind these words, because as Tara said, people make up museums, so it's people that make these statements or choose not to make these statements. And intention is really important because that hopefully drives whatever decisions you decide to make or not make, but there's a reason behind it. And I think if we don't understand the reason as to why you're doing something or not doing something, it makes what you end up saying, if you do end up saying something, almost as if I can't believe it, you're not trustworthy. And as a lot of organizations hold collections in trust for the public, how can you be someone that is trusted to look after something if what you're saying isn't exactly truthful? So I think we have to ask a lot more questions of people that make certain statements, as in, like I've already mentioned, intentions, but do people actually believe in what they've stated? I feel like what Deanna said, questions are really important, but it's really important to ask the right questions, the questions that may make some people feel uncomfortable, not everyone. And I don't think we should shy away from that, because sometimes asking the right question is hopefully getting us towards a better answer so that we can evolve from this conversation instead of asking the same questions and having the same conversations. Also thinking about that notion of, does saying something appear better than silence? Because I can see a lot of assumptions online with people kind of making this kind of blanket statement that if you say nothing, silence is complicit. And I think these are all valid conversations, and it's just important to observe. I think sometimes taking a step back, not to respond, not to react, but just seeing what people are saying is sometimes more of a lesson and more valuable than speaking if you don't really understand what you're potentially going to say. So that's kind of like my thoughts on what these statements have like meant to me, because it's almost 4 months since George Floyd was murdered, which kind of spurred this pre-existing kind of movement, but it spurred it to a lot more people's attention. And I would kind of question how many of those statements have been acted upon within these 4 months. What kind of action, as Deanne mentioned, has actually been has come to fruition? Because these are the questions that we need to be asking, and it would be interesting to kind of see the answers. Can people answer those questions? So I'll leave it there because I can go on a whole other conversation in regards to that question. So let me just stop.
Yeah, we've only got an hour. We've got a few more questions to go. I think just before we ask Tara the same question, if people want to, without actually compromising or saying, you know, which museum or where they actually work, you know, it's entirely up to you. But just to say, you know, in the chat, whether your organisation has released statements, if, like Lisa said, they have done things to follow up, it might be nice to just get a little sense of that in the chat. Tara, what do you think of of the statements, the response, how we can continue making a difference?
I'll try to give this answer as brief as I can. I make no promises, but there'll be an attempt. Over the past weekend, I've been reading, like probably many people, Zadie Smith's Intimations, which is as a sort of collections of essays a sort of an exemplar of observance, of integrity, to use some of the words that my fellow panelists have used, and I think are really important to hone in on, but also in mediation and of kind of settling into a moment. And in the first of the couple of essays in this volume of work, Zaidi writes that writing is control. And it's an interesting phrase, it's an interesting clause, it's something that hasn't left me in the days since reading it. And I don't think it ever will, because also in the essay she writes that, you know, famously, habitually, customarily, writing is thought of as creative, it's thought of as conveyance, and it can be all of those things, it can be all those things at once. But in this instance, in the instance of her writing intimations, and to link it back to the question, which I was meant to answer briefly, writing is control. And I think these statements were control. They were damage control. They were exercises in control, controlling narrative, presenting something in the right moment, seemingly, ostensibly in the right way, to guide audiences, to guide people who observe, like we all do, what museums are doing, what cultural institutions are doing, to guide them away from the realities of these spaces. And quite honestly, I'm glad to hear my fellow panelists say what they said, because I, like them, felt these statements to be performative. I felt resonances of you know, calculation, miscalculation really, in retrospect. And I also felt they lacked integrity, to use the word, another word of the day as brought to us by Lisa. And it's a shame. It's a shame, because those words do matter, and they could have meant a lot, but also what means more is action. And in the 4 odd months since all of those statements have been published and put out into the world, it still remains to be seen what actions have correlated and corresponded and, you know, been engendered by the words, what these words have given rise to. And so I think that's the real shame of it, because, you know, out of control can come some really, really great things. Can come some things that, you know, demarcate the bounds of the past and the present and the future. We could be demarcating the bounds between, you know, these are the ways that the museums operated then. We acknowledge this. These are the way they have operated in sort of present tense. We acknowledge this. And now these are the ways we want them to operate. And we want our audiences to play a part in creating that future. Those statements of control could have seeded that, but they haven't. And yeah, I'm not hopeful that they ever will, to be honest.
Yes, very, very interesting perspective there, Tara. I think I'm hopeful. I can't wait to read the chat after this, because I really want to know what people's responses are to a lot of this, but I'm so busy listening. Given that we're in the situation we're in at the moment with pandemic and lots of other pressures, how do we make sure that sort of anti-racism and the work isn't sort of deprioritized, or, you know, people sort of get desensitized to it because there are lots of other pressing issues that seem to be disconnected. But, you know, what's your take on whether they are connected or not connected? The pandemic, what else is happening in the world, what's happening with Black Lives Matter? So I'm handing that to you, Tara, to start off.
Okay. The notion of deprioritizing something, it's a really heady one. It really is, and it can make a lot of people feel that, you know, these things should be indivisible. Notions and conversations around how we work, where we work, around how we are paid, and transparency, around other forms of discrimination, all valid, all pertinent, and all incredibly, particularly on a day like this, given, you know, the landscape of the world, incredibly pertinent and potent. These things should all be indivisible, and nothing should be deprioritized. but the truth remains that things are, and things so quickly slip out of, dare I say, mainstream conversation, front page news, you know. And in an effort to ensure that doesn't happen with anti-racist work and with conversations such as these, and more importantly, the actions that, you know, are begat by these conversations, because that's really telling. Our words aren't that telling, but what we do thereafter is. In an effort to make sure that these things are connected, indivisible, and therefore prioritized at all times, we need to be more clear about where things intersect. This isn't anything new. I'm obviously leaning on the phrase developed by Kimberly Crenshaw here, intersectionality, but it's a really important one. And I think without it, you know, we run the risk of widening a chasm between different groups, alienating different people from conversations because they don't feel like it's for them, and they may feel, rightly or wrongly, that a surge in conversation is a hot button thing, therefore nothing else matters, which isn't the case. Obviously, we all have our priority concerns in our day-to-day life. We all have sort of limited amount of time and limited bandwidth to deal with the sort of realities that intersect with our personal lives, our interpersonal lives, and the sort of day-to-day wider world issues. But I think if we could look at the ways that things interact and overlap, I think we'd be in a better place to, you know, firstly, to, you know, tackle more things at once. But also, we would have a firmer coalition, a stronger cohort of peoples thinking, even if we're kind of opposing in the ways we want to get things done, but at least we'll have a cohort, a coalition of people who know that things need to be done, and people won't be resistant to that. So I would just say this isn't really an answer that kind of presents a formalized way forward, but it's just to remind people that, you know, in order for things not to be deprioritized when they are and should be a priority, we need to think smart, we need to think hard, and we need to think fast about ways of making sure that we're clear that these issues are intersectional and they affect so many people.
Thank you. Deanne, same question to you. In an uncertain future, how do we make sure anti-racist work isn't deprioritised?
Just to continue from what Tara has been saying,
yeah,
I think on top of that, there is, as she said, it's about this coalition. It's about understanding that we have common struggles. And I think what we've been shown by this particular round of anti-racist movement and protests, I mean, people have talked about it several times, about seeing the different people who are involved in those protests, because one thing that's always come back to me through this whole thing is this idea that it's not affecting everybody. It does. It does. And so, yeah, that intersectionality is really important. But actually, even aside from that, the fact that even within this particular anti-racist movement, everyone gets affected. And it's actually identifying what that means. And that, yes, you may not be subject to the oppression, but it's still impacting you. And I think one thing that I've seen is that as people start to realize the impact it's actually having on them, and it's not like feeling just empathy or sympathy for somebody else, it's actually as well, there is an impact. You have skin in the game, as the phrase is, you know, that there is actually, you are a part of this, whether it be on, not even about being on one side or the other, benefiting from oppression or not benefiting from oppression, but the fact it's having an impact on you as a human being, that as a collective of humans, you are impacted by someone else's pain, whether you decide to acknowledge it or not. It is affecting you. And as soon as we come to that realization, yes, then strengthening that collective, that cohort of understanding that, yes, you have your own individual priorities or particular priorities that affect you because of your life experience. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't support somebody else, because it will eventually impact you anyway. So support them and they will support you. It's about getting that mentality. And I think that's really important if we are going to move forward and keep this movement and this work going. Not even movement, because I just think it's about dismantling, as a title is, dismantling racism is about having us all involved. We talk about who's responsible for it, who needs to be involved in it in order, you know, that it's not just about the people who've always known it's happening and have felt the impact, but it's about those who benefit from it in some ways. And I will still say that in some ways benefit from it, and in varying degrees, including myself. How we're involved, who's doing what, who's responsible for making sure things are happening, and check, you know, the systems, who were the systems built by are being dismantled by those peoples, and not offspring, that's not the word, but you know, the generations, the future generations of those people who set these things up. And it's not about it being a long time ago, because we are all being impacted by it right now and will continue to do so. So yeah, it's a tricky one, because there isn't, it's almost a mentality and that acknowledgement, so you can take your part and your responsibility and your part within that to make the change. But we won't, it cannot be divisive. It cannot be just this, it has to be different people doing different parts of that work, because it's massive and complicated and layered and steeped in, rooted, has long roots, and that takes everyone to start digging that up. You know, if anyone's been in the garden recently in lockdown, you know how hard it is to get rid of those weed systems. So like, this is not a one-person job, you know, and that's how I kind of see it. But yeah, but that's always being informed by, you know, things I'm hearing as well. So
yeah, thank you. Lisa, how do we get everybody involved? How do we get people to see that it's not a case of them and us, or you know, it doesn't affect me? I think, you know, it'd be interesting to hear your perspective on Deanne's point of view, that everybody is affected. I said infected, that was a bit of a slip of the tongue, but you know where I'm going. Everybody is affected by it, and how do we get everybody to acknowledge it and get involved?
I think that people need to care, and that relates to kind of what Tara said in the beginning. I think people, if it starts with people caring about anti-racism, which is what we're talking about today, and relating to the fact that it does impact everyone, it impacts us in different ways. And I think it's understanding those kind of nuances. And that's why I feel like reflection, self-reflection is really important, because we're having this conversation right now in this space, but we are all coming at it from different angles, because we're individual people and we have our own lived experiences. And I say that in the case of that's applied to everyone that's on this call right now. So if we're coming at things from different perspectives, how do we come together? And I think a lot of that is about listening, but people do then need to actually care about what people are saying. And I think those two things don't happen enough. And why, as Tara said, I don't feel like conversations have evolved further than this point, despite the fact that we are resting on the shoulders of people that have kind of taken this conversation to where it needs to be at this point now. But when we look back at this time in history, we're going to be thinking, why were we still at this point when we should have been so much further along? So I think we need to care, and then we need to act, because the whole point of anti-racism is action. So if we want anti-racism to be prioritized, which I don't feel like it was prioritized properly in the first place, because it wasn't specific within the sector. You only have to type in anti-racism within UK museums in Google to just see basically all of the statements that were made by certain organizations take up the first few pages. Beyond that, it's very hard to find specific examples of when anti-racism was a so-called priority within the UK museum sector. But going back to my point about the action, it's then about the effort. And if those things are in place, I feel like that is when anti-racism will probably be more prioritized, because at the foundation, people care, people will put the effort in, and they want to put the effort in. There's a difference between being forced to do something because you're told, but doing something because you believe it's right. And then the action follows from that, and it's sustained because everyone understands the reason why they're doing something. Everyone has the motivation to want to do something, to do this thing. We're working together. It doesn't rest on one or two people in a department to try and fix a whole organizational problem, which then reflects, you know, across the sector more widely, because that doesn't make sense. How can two people or groups of people try and fix this huge problem mathematically? That literally doesn't make sense. So those are we need foundations, I think, in order for anti-racism to be prioritized in the first place. But you have to understand what are those building blocks to get to that question, let alone answer it. So that's kind of my thoughts on how it doesn't become deprioritized, even though I didn't believe it was prioritized in the first place.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, I've got about 2 minutes to quickly ask the next question. So I'm going to ask it, and then any one of you can start the conversation around the answer. But yeah, we need to try and answer it very quickly. And that is, what could dismantling racism in museums look like now and in the future? Or what doesn't it look like? Any of you three? Just unmute and go for it. No? Lisa, what does it look like? What doesn't it look like?
Deanne was going. Deanne, please go ahead.
Oh, Deanne was going. Okay.
I was like, we'll do it together. Don't worry. I was really because I don't know. I mean, I have in my head this beautiful picture, and I think what I was going to say, my one word was imagination. You know, I need to read this book. There's been some great quotes from it. I can't remember. Terrible memory. But thinking about Miss Channing Brown, I'm going to call her because I can't remember her first name. Austin Channing Brown. But thinking about a future, and if you can imagine it, then you can help to form it. And really thinking about what could this new future be is a really interesting idea, because it could be many things. I think there isn't one answer to this. Obviously, I think it's, and again, because of that, because it's not like a definitive answer, it goes back to, as you said, integrity, intentions, the impact, and it being about a sector that genuinely understands where they started from and what their purpose was when they began. And to be blatant, that was to support a system of white supremacy and oppression. Like, that's the time in which they were built. That's when they came about. So, you know, but acknowledging that, and as I think Tara said before, and making those delineations about, so what do we do? What have we done since then? What does that matter? Did that make any difference? I mean, you know, and what bits were great and what bits do we need to do better? And how then move forward? Like they're being those lines and going, but for me, I really feel that if the first thing is an acknowledgement, if it isn't there, then it's not built on anything. Like the future, it's on shifting sands. Until there is acknowledgement and a kind of, this is what's happened, then everything else around it could change afterwards. Oh, I don't like that idea anymore. As you said, what's the purpose? And the purpose is that originally that's what it was, and we want a new purpose, and we need to make that new purpose and stick to it for, and I hate to be a little bit cynical here, for whatever the reasons they are, because sometimes yes, I would love it to be just about people genuinely just caring and understanding that care of others. But I know how business works, and sometimes there are other motivations and other drivers that will accompany that to make it stronger. I feel a bit dirty saying that, but you know, I want it to be all the good and the straight and narrow, but actually,
you're a realist as well.
Well, yeah. The bottom line is that there are different drivers are out there, and so it will be necessary to recognize those as well in this new future to make it last. But I think, yeah, I want to be hopeful, but until I see that first step, the realist in me just says, how much effort can I personally put into it until that's done? Yeah. To look into a future. So Go on, Lisa.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Lisa, what does museum system that has dismantled racism look like? What can you imagine?
I can imagine at present, in order to get to the future, a space in which defensiveness doesn't occupy all of these conversations, because I found defensiveness really interesting to observe. Sometimes almost funny, even though the context is not funny, because I can't believe that, you know, someone being called out for kind of something results in that response. And it makes these conversations, which I don't think are difficult, even more difficult. So I feel like if people, which is why I really am someone that advocates for self-reflection, if we all get defensive, that's not the issue. It's about when you're called out on something, whether you didn't consider a wide enough range of people's perspectives or opinions on something, or you generally got something wrong. If your first response is to be defensive, I don't see how dismantling racism in museums is going to actually occur, because it's so tiring to actually address the defensive nature of the conversation rather than addressing the real crux of why we're all here. So I feel like, for me, dismantling racism looks like there's no defensiveness in people's conduct when they're being told about something, because that's the real quality and skill of being a good listener, is to get over, you know, someone critiquing you, because we all make mistakes. Not saying I agree with all mistakes, but we all make mistakes, and it's about how do you respond to that. If you're going to just get defensive, then it's halting progress. So I feel like anytime you feel like getting defensive, if someone answers you a question, number one, don't take it personally. Sometimes it is personal and there is rationale behind that. But also it's about thinking, what other response or reaction can serve in this moment right now? And those 2 seconds thinking about that, rather than just knee-jerk reaction into defensiveness, could actually be one of the differences between having a productive conversation and then having the same conversation 6 months down the line in a conference similar to this. So for me, defensiveness is what is one of the reasons that are halting dismantling racism in museums. Not sure if that's pragmatic, not sure if that's realistic, but that's how I feel, and observing it. I don't know if anyone else has observed it. I'm sure people have, but it's just a really strange thing to observe, and it's a problem. So it needs to get sorted out. So that's my 2 cents on that one.
Yeah, I like that answer. I think that's brilliant, because as humans, we're all kind of predisposed to a bit of defensiveness. And you're right, it halts things. It means that, you know, the conversations go round and round and round and you don't feel like you're getting anywhere. So I like the idea of just waiting for a second and thinking, you know, not knee-jerk reaction, but actually considering and listening to what the other person's saying. That's brilliant. Tara, I am going to, because we're very short on time, we've got 4 minutes left. So I'm going to ask you one of the questions that was sent in to the MA previously, and it's a very long one, so I'm going to read it again. It has been suggested to me that museums stop using the word diversifying and instead start thinking about this work as intersectional equality. I just wondered what your thoughts are on this. Are you happy to answer that one?
I think, as has been, or I've made clear already, the word intersectional is a blessed word to me. It's a lovely question. And I think semantic questions, though, more generally, as this one also is, can be a tricky one, because when we do get bogged down in semantics, we can lose sight on the prevailing issue at hand. I don't think this is one of those times, though, to be particular, to be precise of our language, as more of us are having to be in all quarters of our life, in our personal life, in our interpersonal life, in our working life, etc. And we're seeing that more and more, the conversations around whether, why, how, and whether to not use the term EAME, how it's even pronounced, to be honest, whether we are nullifying, obfuscating the realities of people that are, you know, kind of formed and forced under that umbrella. And I would say, as someone who uses that term sparingly, and honestly doesn't shirk away from when it is used in things, but occasionally does roll their eyes at it. I think it is important to acknowledge the fact that language can be tricky, but it is also imperative to be better at using it and better at sort of wagering it and being clearer with it. So I would say, to the point of that, whether we should move away from using terms like diversity or diversifying in favour of something that encompasses notions of intersectionality, yes. But I would also say that ultimately, when we are doing the work that must be done, the language is sadly, shamefully, but also thankfully secondary. When we're actually doing the work that needs to be done, and we're conveying that through our actions, through our intentions, and we're doing it with integrity, again, word of the day, then the language will follow. The language will catch up with us, but we must also be prepared to, at times, catch up with language too, and to evolve with it. So, in just clarifying all of the many words I've said now, I'm always interested in what people think about how to use language. I think we should all be a little bit more primed to change. We should be engaging in what's termed as, in the sort of Black feminist tradition, witness work, bearing witness, paying witness to the way things happen and the way things evolve, and charting that, at the very least for ourselves, but also for others around us. Being very careful and providing and sharing care, redistributing care. And if we can do that, we start doing that through our language, that's a great place to start. But ultimately, it's only a beginning, it's only a start. And we need to push harder and further.
That's brilliant, thank you. And that's a great place to finish, I think. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm kind of seeing in the corner of my eye as well, as you were talking there, Tara, lots of people in the chat saying, we're just getting started. I wish this conversation could go on longer than an hour. How can we carry on this conversation? And I think that's, you know, we need to find ways to carry on these conversations and to do the work and to be able to use the language and to not be defensive, but to have integrity, acknowledge intersectionality, all of the things that we've been talking about. I wonder if I could bring Antonia back in very briefly, because I've been so busy listening to our panelists who have been amazing. I haven't been able to keep up reading with the chat, but I don't know if there's any questions that were burning on the chat that you feel that we should quickly address. If anyone has to leave because it is 7 o'clock, please feel free to, you know, and thank you for coming. But yes, is there anything that you think we should cover?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of really amazing engagement inspired by this fantastic conversation and everything that you've shared. And I think that message of wanting to continue the conversation that you've picked up, Hannah, is definitely coming through, which is brilliant. That's what we need. And I think this is about knowing that just because this session is ending doesn't mean that engagement in this work on this ends. You know, take these conversations back to institutions, to organizations, to your networks. I know I'm feeling incredibly inspired, so I think I will bring the session to a close, although I wish I could just hijack it and stay on for an hour, but I think we will bring it to a close. And I just want to say, and I'm sure everybody on the chat is like, you can see it's already happening, I just want to say a massive thank you to all of you. Huge thanks to Hannah, to Deanne, to Lisa, to Tara. Just thanks for your time, thanks for sharing your experiences, and really giving us all sort of pause to not just think, but to keep acting, to act with integrity, to be accountable. And I think, ending on the point that Deanne said, thinking about, you know, how can we build and imagine change in the future? So a massive thank you. Big thanks to everyone who joined and who's participated on the chat. Just to say that our next coronavirus conversation is on museum ethics. It's on the 7th of October in 2 weeks' time. And I think that session is going to touch on and continue some of the things that have been discussed today. Details on how to book are on the events page on the Museums Association website. And yeah, just to say again, a massive thank you. It's been a privilege to hear the conversation today. Yeah, and take care.
Thank you so much. Bye.